Hi guys, this is Kumar. Today we are going to learn about ADP, that is adenosine diphosphate, ATP, that is adenosine triphosphate, and cellular respiration. So let's start with what is ATP. So all the living organisms, they need energy to reproduce, to grow, and even to move. So if you are running, walking, you need energy. Or you are doing any other activity, you need energy. So where does this energy comes from? So the energy is produced in each cell of your body in the form of adenosine triphosphate, which is in short called as ATP. And this ATP is an organic molecule containing high energy phosphate bonds. So if you remember what is an organic molecule, so an molecule which contains carbon is called as organic molecule. So this is obvious that if we're calling as ATP as an organic molecule, that means it is made up of carbon atoms. So let's look at the chemical structure of ATP. So as the name suggests, adenosine triphosphate, that means it has three parts. Starting with adenine, it has an adenine base and a ribose sugar, and there are three phosphates. So you can see one phosphate here, two, and three phosphate. And these phosphates are combined with each other, or they are joined with each other with a chemical bond. So in short, this is ATP, or it's called as adenosine triphosphate. So tri means there are three phosphates joined together with a chemical bond, and it has a one ribose sugar. So what does ATP do for you? So it supplies you with energy. So whenever you eat food, that food is digested, and that digested food gets converted into glucose, that is C6H12O6, and that glucose goes into each cell of your body, and that glucose is converted into ATP. And what does ATP does? That ATP stores energy. So whenever you need energy to do any type of activities, like you want to walk, move, run, or even your smaller metabolic activities inside your body, they all need energy. So this energy is stored in ATP. You can say this ATP is a kind of bond which is used to release energy. So it supplies energy whenever it is required. So how do we get energy from ATP? So by breaking the high energy bond between the last two phosphate in ATP. So if you remember this is adenine, and this is ribose sugar, and these are three phosphate bond. So whenever you require energy, one of the phosphate bond breaks off and the energy is released. So these phosphate bonds are joined with each other with a high energy bonds. And whenever these high energy bonds are broken, and how these are broken? By hydrolysis. So if you remember from polymers, the big polymers are broken down into small monomers or small segments by adding water, and that process is called as hydrolysis. So in the same manner, this is a polymer. ATP is a polymer, and one of the phosphate is broken by adding water to it, and that process is called as hydrolysis. So when one phosphate is broken, there are two phosphate left. So this ATP gets converted into ADP, that is adenosine triphosphate, and one bond is broken of the phosphate, gets converted into ADP, that is there are two phosphate left, so we call that as adenosine diphosphate. So what is the process called as? When the ATP gets converted into ADP by one of the phosphates gets knocked off, that process is called as hydrolysis, because water is added at the other end. So if this is a phosphate, and you can see there are three phosphates, the last phosphate is knocked off by water, and here the water molecule is added. So this process is called as hydrolysis. So remember that the polymers gets converted into small molecules or monomers by addition of water, and that process is called as hydrolysis. Now how does that happen? How does ATP gets converted into ADP? And that's through an enzyme called as ATPase. So remember this, if there is ASE, that means enzyme. So ATP is broken into ADP, that is adenosine triphosphate is converted into adenosine diphosphate by an help of an enzyme called as ATPase. So when ATP gets converted into ADP, energy is released, and this energy is used for various activities like reproduction, growth, or various metabolic activities. Now, continuously you need energy to do various activities, and you need to make ATP in your body or in the cell. So how is ATP remade, or how is ATP made? The reverse of the previous process, in which you saw that ATP gets converted into ADP by the enzyme called ATPase. The opposite of that is there is another enzyme which is called as ATP synthetase. That converts the ADP into ATP. So going back, the enzyme ATPase breaks down the ATP into ADP, and the ATP synthetase converts ADP into ATP. So there is a cycle of ADP and ATP. So the ATP gets converted into ADP whenever the energy is required, but you need to also store energy for the future activity which a cell stores in the form of ATP. So whenever you require energy, you convert the ATP into ADP and the energy is released, but your body stores the energy in the form of ATP, so it needs to make ATP in the cell. So the ADP-ATP cycle goes on. So you remember that to break down one of the phosphate bond, the enzyme ATPase is required, and to convert ADP into ATP, ATP synthetase is required. So ATP synthase add one of the phosphate to these two phosphate to make into ATP. So when is ATP made in the body? So during a process called as cellular respiration that takes place in both plants and animals, and That process is called as cellular respiration, in which the ATP is made in the body. And ATP is made inside the cell organelle called as the mitochondria, which is also called as the powerhouse of the cell. So to know that reaction, how the ATP is produced, you need to know that is a redox reaction. So what is a redox reaction? It's a chemical reaction in which there is the transfer of one or more electrons. So if we are talking about the transfer of electron, there has to be one reactant, and there has to be another reactant to receive that electron. So oxidation is the loss of electrons, and reduction is the addition of the electrons. So when you combine these two processes, we call that as redox. That means reduction oxidation reaction. So in oxidation there is a loss of electron, and in reduction there is an addition of electrons. So because the electron transfer requires a donor and acceptor, so oxidation and reduction, they go hand in hand, and that's why we call that as a redox reaction. So let's look at a cellular respiration. So cellular respiration requires glucose and oxygen. So glucose in cellular respiration is oxidized and oxygen is reduced. So that reaction is called as a redox reaction. So if we are talking that glucose is oxidized, that means, going back to this definition, the oxidation is loss of electron and reduction is addition of electron. So the glucose lose the electron and oxygen gains the electron. So that's why glucose is oxidized and oxygen is reduced. So in cellular respiration, the glucose break down through oxidation reduction reaction that we also call as redox reaction. So let's look at the overall equation for cellular respiration. So this is C6H12O6, which is glucose. So when glucose combines with oxygen, it gives carbon dioxide, water, electrons, and it gives 38 ATP. So 38 ATP is produced at the end of the cellular respiration. So just to sum up, that when glucose in the cell combines with oxygen, it gives carbon dioxide, water, and some electrons are released, and there are 38 ATP molecules are produced. So if we are talking about the redox reaction, that is, what type of process is a cellular respiration? So it's a kind of redox reaction, that is, oxidation and reduction takes place. Oxidation of glucose, and when the glucose is oxidized, that is, electron is removed from glucose, it gets converted into carbon dioxide and water. And the reduction of oxygen to H2O, that means electron is passed to oxygen. So the glucose gets converted into carbon dioxide and water, and when the oxygen is reduced, it gets converted into water, that is H2O, and this is all as a redox reaction. So when we are talking about the transfer of electrons, it is not directly given to the molecules, but there are some carriers to carry the electrons. So what carries the electrons are NAD and NADH. So that is, These molecules NAD and NADH are the carriers of the electrons.